Chapter 1. The Twin Cities of Harmony. The jungle canopy stretched endlessly, its emerald hues shimmering beneath the light of Lustria's twin suns. Birds with feathers of iridescent blue and gold flitted between ancient vine-draped trees, their calls mingling with the distant roar of waterfalls. The air was thick with the hum of insects and the rustling of reptilian beasts prowling the undergrowth. Amid this primordial paradise, two temple cities, Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal, rose like colossal monuments to the glory of the old ones. Chaq-Huac stood as a bastion of strength and order, its ziggurats piercing the sky. Carved stone reliefs of snarling Saurus warriors adorned its walls, each telling tales of martial triumph. The city pulsed with disciplined energy, ranks of Saurus warriors trained in perfect unison, their scales gleaming under the midday sun. Skinks scurried about, meticulously tending to sacred pools and preparing offerings for the slain Mage-Priest, who slumbered in deep meditation. In contrast, Tla'Zatal exuded an air of serene wisdom. Its sprawling terraces were covered in lush greenery, with waterways flowing in harmonious patterns through the city's heart. Great murals depicted the Old One's creation of the lizard men, emphasizing unity and balance. Skink priests chanted melodic hymns, their voices hauled great stones to reinforce the city's ancient aqueducts. Above all, the great temple of Tla'Zatal radiated tranquility, its sacred observatory glimmering with celestial markers. In 2700, for centuries, Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal thrived as siblings, each fulfilling complementary roles in the Great Plan. Chaq-Huac safeguarded the northern jungles with its indomitable armies, while Tla'Zatal served as a beacon of spiritual guidance and intellectual pursuit. Though their methods differed, their shared devotion to the Old Ones had kept them united. Until now. The night of the celestial convergence was an event of profound importance. Priests from both cities gathered in the neutral grounds of the Starfall Plateau, where ancient stone circles aligned perfectly with the heavens. The sky above was a masterpiece of shifting constellations, each a fragment of the Old One's divine script. Skink priests chanted in unison as the stars reached their zenith, their voices blending with the low hum of glyph-bearing artifacts glowing in response. All eyes turned to the heavens as a comet streaked across the sky, its tail of shimmering jade illuminating the jungle below. The priests of Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal began the will of the Old Ones. The first voice to rise was that of Chaq-Huac, High Priest of Chaq-Huac. His crest flared with righteous conviction as he stepped forward, his claws gripping the golden staff of his office. "The comet heralds a purification," he declared. "The Old Ones demand we scour our ranks of taint. Skinks, Saurus, even Croxagore. None are exempt if they show the signs of corruption. Only through militant vigilance can we preserve the purity of the Great Plan." A ripple of approval coursed through the priests of Chaq-Huac. Their warriors nodded solemnly, their tails twitching in anticipation. Chaq-Huatl's interpretation resonated deeply with their city's martial ethos. It moved slowly. "No," she said, her gaze sweeping the gathered assembly. "The comet speaks of unity. The Great Plan demands preservation, not destruction. We must gather our people, strengthen our bonds, and protect what the Old Ones have built. To sow fear and division is to betray their will." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement among her own followers, their faces reflecting her steadfast resolve. The two interpretations could not have been more opposed, and tension crackled like static in the humid air. The gathering dissolved into heated debate. Priests from both cities argued fervently, each side accusing the other of misreading the sacred signs. Chaq-Huatl accused Tla'Zatal of cowardice, of hiding behind lofty ideals while the jungle teemed with threats. Ziggurats countered, accusing Chaq-Huac of being a blind zealotry that endangered the very fabric of their society. By dawn, the conclave had ended in disarray. The priests departed to their respective cities, their hearts heavy with the seeds of discord. In the weeks that followed, the disagreement festered like an open wound. Chaq-Huac began fortifying its borders, sending its Saurus patrols deeper into the jungle and scrutinizing its ranks for signs of taint. Rumors of purges spread like wildfire, unsettling the skink communities. Meanwhile, Tla'Zatal called for regional leaders to reaffirm their alliances, offering sanctuary to those fleeing Chaq-Huac's harsh decrees. Their message of unity attracted neighboring tribes, swelling their influence and straining resources. The delicate harmony that had defined their relationship was unraveling. Unbeknownst to either city, their escalating conflict was being watched from the shadows, the seeds of civil war sowing fertile ground for an even darker threat. The PTSD Scott describes before looked at the events of recent days as the start of a crisis. Chapter 2. The Scholars Divide. The chamber of Ziggurats, priest-king of Chaq-Huac, was a fortress of stone and fire. Towering effigies of ancient Saurus warriors loomed over him, their eyes burning with inset rubies that reflected the glow of the braziers. His scaled himself sat upon a throne carved from obsidian, his scaled hands gripping the armrests as he listened to the latest reports from his advisors. His body, a mass of rippling muscle and scarred scales, exuded strength and command. His crown, a golden helm adorned with jagged feathers, marked him as the city's unquestioned ruler. More reports of disobedience among the skink priests, rasped a senior skink attendant, bowing low. "They question the purity of your decree, my lord." Zlen's deep, guttural voice rumbled through the chamber. "Then they too must be tested. The old ones demand unwavering loyalty. Tla'Zatal poisons the weak with their indulgent talk of unity. We must remain vigilant." He calls Navarre's name, interpreted them. When Navarre answers, he repeats the name in hopes that the counselor will realize the shift. To Shotlan, strength was clarity. The great plan was a battle, a relentless march towards survival, and only the pure and disciplined would endure. He had seen the ruin brought by laxity, the jungles littered with the remains of cities that had faltered in their devotion. Chaq-Huac would not suffer such a fate, not under his rule. Far to the south, Chaq-Huac, high priestess of Tla'Zatal, stood atop the great ziggurat of her city, her robes of emerald and sapphire billowing in the breeze. The ziggurat's summit offered a breathtaking view of the city, its waterways glimmering in the midday sun. Chaq-Huac held a staff topped with an ornate glyph of the old ones, her crest a radiant display of vibrant plumage. Below her, skink priests and scholars gathered in fervent debate. Chaq-Huac raised her hand, and the crowd quieted. Her voice was calm, yet commanding, carrying the weight of centuries of wisdom. "The great plan is not a call to division," she declared. "We are one people, created by the old ones to serve their will. The celestial signs demand unity, not bloodshed. If we succumb to mistrust and fear, we betray everything we stand for." Her words resonated with her followers, who saw her as the living embodiment of the Old One's vision of harmony. Yet even in Tla'Zatal, doubts festered. Some whispered that Chaq-Huac's purges, though brutal, were a necessary step to ensure survival. Others feared that Tla'Zatal's pacifism left them vulnerable to aggression. In both cities, the silence of the Slan Mage-Priests weighed heavily. These ancient beings, the living conduits of the Old One's will, remained locked in their deep meditations, impervious to the mounting crisis. Skink priests pleaded for their guidance, only to be met with stillness. Without their divine insight, Ziggurats and Chaq-Huac filled the void, their interpretations hardening into dogma. The divisions spread beyond the ruling classes. Skink scholars, traditionally the neutral stewards of knowledge, found themselves drawn into the conflict. In Chaq-Huac, those who questioned the purges were branded as traitors. Many fled northward, seeking refuge in Tla'Zatal, where they were welcomed but treated with suspicion by more zealous factions. Saurus leaders, once bound by an unshakable loyalty to the Great Plan, began to fracture as well. Veteran warriors from Chaq-Huac, hardened by years of combat, aligned with Jotlan's call for vigilance. They saw Tla'Zatal's approach as naive and dangerous, a dereliction of duty. Meanwhile, Saurus leaders in Tla'Zatal defended Ziggurats. Meanwhile, Tla'Zatal's approach is naivety rather than constant warfare. Neutral territories became battlegrounds of ideology. Chaq-Huac extended its patrols into disputed regions, demanding oaths of loyalty from skink tribes and lesser settlements. Tla'Zatal countered by sending emissaries to these same territories, offering aid and protection in exchange for allegiance. These skirmishes, though small, shattered centuries-old alliances and deepened the rift. One moonless night, in the dense jungle between the two cities, a secret meeting took place. A skink scholar from Chaq-Huac, Ketli, and a Saurus warrior from Tla'Zatal, Chaq-Huac, met in the shadow of an ancient ruin. Ketli's crest drooped with weariness, while Chaq-Huac's massive frame bristled with tension. "We must stop this madness," Ketli hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Great Plan is not ours to twist for our own ends." Chaq-Huac's reptilian eyes narrowed, and yet both cities claim to act in its name. If neither will listen, how do we stop them? Ketli hesitated. "We must find the truth. The Old Ones left us signs, ancient glyphs, sacred texts. If we can uncover their true will, we might bridge this divide." Chaq-Huac nodded slowly, his claws flexing. "Then let us hope the jungle does not consume us before we find it." Bishop. The two unlikely allies disappeared into the shadows, their fragile alliance a glimmer of hope amid the growing storm. Back in their respective cities, Jotlan and Chaq-Huac prepared for the next steps in their escalating confrontation. Chaq-Huac ordered the construction of war beasts to patrol Chaq-Huac's borders, while Chaq-Huac convened a council of allied leaders to strategize their defense. They arranged for Chaq-Huac to lead vocal exercises, of course, the moment he reached the town. The jungle buzzed with tension, the fragile harmony between the twin cities splintering into factions. Beneath the surface, unseen forces began to stir, feeding on the chaos as the scholars and warriors of Lustria marched toward an uncertain and perilous future. Chapter 3. The Prophecy of Blood. The jungle was alive with sound as dawn broke over Lustria. The dense foliage of the neutral territories thrummed with the cries of unseen beasts and the rustle of unseen movements. Here, amid the tangled vines and moss-covered ruins of a forgotten temple, a group of skink foragers stumbled upon a discovery that would alter the fate of the twin cities. The skinks had been searching for medicinal herbs when they uncovered the relic. The ground near the ruins, soft and damp, had given way beneath one of their steps, revealing a hidden chamber. Inside, a golden plaque lay enshrined, untouched for centuries. Its surface was etched with intricate glyphs that shimmered faintly in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. The leader of the foragers, a skink named Tla'Zatal, knelt before the relic, his crest flattening in awe. "The will of the Old Ones," he whispered. "We must bring this to the priests." The plaque was carried with reverence to a nearby outpost, where messengers from both Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal were quickly summoned. The news of its discovery spread like wildfire, and soon both cities dispatched emissaries to claim the artifact. The gathering at the temple ruins. Priests and warriors from both cities converged on the ruins within days. From Chaq-Huac came Chaq-Huac, the fiery high priest who had first proclaimed the need for purges. His entourage included armored Saurus warriors and even a hulking Bastillodon, its great shell adorned with glowing runes. From Tla'Zatal came Chaq-Huac herself, flanked by her most trusted skink emissaries and croxigors bearing ceremonial banners. The golden plaque was placed on a stone altar at the heart of the ruins, its glyphs glowing faintly. Both sides gathered in tense silence as the priests began to decipher its meaning. Chaq-Huac was the first to speak. The glyphs warn of a fractured path. This is clear evidence that corruption festers among us. The old ones demand vigilance. We must root out impurity before it is too late. Chaq-Huac's eyes narrowed. You see only what you wish to see, Chaq-Huac. The fractured path is not corruption, it is discord. The great plan falters not because of impurity, but because of our division. Unity is the key to preserving the Old One's will. The arguments escalated as priests from both cities offered conflicting interpretations. The tension among the gathered warriors was palpable. Hands gripped weapons and tails flicked anxiously. The jungle seemed to hold its breath as the two sides debated, each refusing to yield. The assassination. Ring any bells? Recognizing that the debate would not be resolved here, Chaq-Huac proposed a temporary truce. Let us return to our cities and consult our scholars. This relic holds the key to our survival, but its meaning must be fully understood. Reluctantly, Chaq-Huac agreed. The relic was to remain under neutral guard while the cities deliberated. A skink emissary from Tla'Zatal, Tets, was appointed to oversee the negotiations and ensure fairness. That night, as the jungle was enveloped in darkness, chaos erupted. Tetzel was found dead near the relic's altar, his body pierced by an ornate dagger bearing the markings of Chaq-Huac. The neutral guards, skinks from surrounding tribes, were thrown into disarray, and accusations flew like venom-tipped darts. Chaq-Huac, upon hearing the news, was incensed. "This is an act of war," she declared. "Chaq-Huac seeks to silence truth through bloodshed." From his throne in Chaq-Huac, Xotlan denied the accusations vehemently. "This is a ploy by Tla'Zatal to turn the neutral tribes against us. We would never dishonor the Old One's relic with such treachery." The fallout. The assassination shattered any hope of diplomacy. Both cities began mobilizing their forces, each convinced of the other's culpability. Skink emissaries who once traversed the jungle freely now traveled only with armed escorts, their messages fraught with hostility. Neutral tribes, once loyal to both cities, began choosing sides or retreating into isolation, unwilling to be drawn into the brewing conflict. Meanwhile, whispers of darker forces at work spread among the skink priests. The dagger used in Tetzel's murder, though bearing Tetzel's markings, seemed older than any weapon currently in use. Some speculated it had been planted to sow discord, but by whom no one could say. At the ruins, the relic remained under guard, its golden glyphs glowing faintly, as if mocking the turmoil it had unleashed. The jungle around it grew eerily silent, as though the land itself mourned the fractured unity of its protectors. In a fractured path, back in Chaq-Huac, Xotlan stood on the steps of his great ziggurat, addressing his gathered warriors. His voice thundered across the plaza. Tla'Zatal has shown its true colors. They seek to undermine us, to corrupt the great plan with their false unity. We will not falter. The Old Ones demand strength, and we shall deliver it. In Tla'Zatal, Chaq-Huac gathered her council. We face an enemy blinded by zealotry, she said, her tone heavy with sorrow. But we must not become like them. Our strength lies in unity, even as we prepare to defend ourselves. The lines were drawn, the fractured path now clear for all to see. As the twin cities marched toward conflict, the prophecy of blood etched upon the golden plaque seemed less a warning and more a grim inevitability. Chapter 4. The March of Saurus. The jungle around Chaq-Huac was alive with the sounds of preparation. Saurus warriors assembled in disciplined ranks within the shadow of the city's great Ziggurats, their gleaming weapons catching the faint sunlight that pierced the canopy. Priests moved among them, chanting blessings to the Old Ones, as scaled attendants painted glyphs of war upon the Saurus's scaled hides. Astrodons and stagerdons, their massive forms adorned with armor and ceremonial banners, lumbered into formation under the command of their handlers. At the center of it all stood Chaq-Huac, the priest-king of Chaq-Huac. His golden helm reflected the flames of ceremonial braziers, and his eyes burned with resolve. War is inevitable, he declared to the assembled warriors. Tla'Zatal has betrayed the Old Ones and the great plan. We shall march to cleanse their heresy and restore purity to the sacred jungles. The Saurus roared in unison, a guttural sound that shook the very ground. The priest-king turned to Chaq-Huac, his trusted high priest, who nodded in grim agreement. Our enemies are weak, Chaq-Huac said, but they are cunning. We must strike decisively. Tla'Zatal's reluctant defense? In Tla'Zatal, the atmosphere was far more somber. Chaq-Huac stood atop her ziggurat, her heart heavy as she watched her city prepare for war. Unlike Chaq-Huac, whose armies were bred for battle, Tla'Zatal relied heavily on its Croxagors and skink cohorts. The massive Croxagors, wielding enormous stone hammers, stood ready, their deep growls a reminder of their formidable power. Skink priests and warriors formed defensive patrols, their smaller size compensated by agility and tactical coordination. Chaq-Huac addressed her council of priests. We must be prepared to defend ourselves, she said, but we will not strike first. The Old Ones demand unity, not bloodshed, yet we cannot allow Chaq-Huac's aggression to destroy us. Her commanders nodded, though some among them grumbled. The Croxagor leader, Gortux, rumbled in his deep voice. Unity cannot exist if the other side seeks only destruction. Chaq-Huac sighed, knowing the truth in his words. She gave the order to fortify the city's borders, sending skink cohorts to outlying territories to rally support and monitor Chaq-Huac's movements. Espionage and shadows. Amid the rising tensions, both cities deployed their spies to gather intelligence. Skink scouts and chameleon skinks from Chaq-Huac moved silently through the jungle, their scales blending seamlessly with the foliage. They observed Tla'Zatal's defenses, noting weaknesses in the waterway fortifications and the reliance on Croxagors for heavy combat. Meanwhile, Tla'Zatal's scouts infiltrated Chaq-Huac's borders, uncovering disturbing signs. Glyphs on temple walls seemed to contradict Chaq-Huac's proclamations of purity, hinting at a possible misinterpretation or deliberate manipulation of the great plan. In the heart of Chaq-Huac, a chameleon skink observed a secret meeting between a shadowy figure and one of Chaq-Huac's advisors, though the details of their conversation remained elusive. Both sides found evidence that fueled their fears. Reports of strange, unnatural phenomena, crops withering near sacred pools, unusual behavior among jungle creatures, spread through both cities. Some priests whispered of chaos's influence, while others dismissed these omens as tricks by the enemy. The skirmish. The fragile stalemate finally shattered on the banks of the Venom-Shade River, a contested border region. A small skink cohort from Tla'Zatal had been sent to negotiate safe passage for a group of displaced tribes. Unknown to them, a patrol from Chaq-Huac, led by the Saurus captain Chaq-Huac, was already stationed there. The encounter began with tense words exchanged across the river. The skink emissary raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "We come only to aid those who have been displaced by this conflict. Let us pass, and no blood need be spilled." Another interpretation tightened the hand pressing. Naria's eyes narrowed, his claws tightening around his weapon. "No one passes. This territory is under the protection of Chaq-Huac. Leave, or face the consequences." Before the emissary could respond, an arrow shot from the jungle, striking Chaq-Huac in the throat. The Saurus captain roared in pain as chaos erupted. Believing themselves under attack, the Saurus charged across the river, their weapons cutting through the skink cohort with brutal efficiency. Tla'Zatal's forces fought back, but they were outmatched, and the river ran red with their blood. Among the casualties was Ziggurats, the Kroxagor leader of Tla'Zatal, who had arrived to reinforce the cohort. His death sent shockwaves through his city, where he had been a symbol of strength and stability. In Chaq-Huac, the loss of Chaq-Huac enraged the Saurus legions, who now demanded retribution. The divide deepens. News of the skirmish spread rapidly, each side blaming the other. Jiutlan declared the incident proof of Tla'Zatal's treachery, calling for a full-scale march on the city. "Their heresy knows no bounds," he proclaimed. "We must act now, before they destroy us all." In Tla'Zatal, Chaq-Huac mourned the loss of Ziggurats, her resolve hardening. "They leave us no choice," she told her council. "We must stand firm. We will not strike first, but we will be ready when they come." As both cities prepared for war, the jungle itself seemed to recoil from the impending conflict. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the air grew thick with an unnatural stillness. Unseen forces stirred in the shadows, feeding on the division and preparing to strike when the cities were at their weakest. The march of the Saurus had begun, and with it, the first steps toward a civil war that would shake Lustria to its core. Chapter 5. The Cold-Blooded Tempest. The dense jungle of Lustria quivered with anticipation. Vines hung heavy with moisture, and the calls of unseen creatures echoed through the oppressive heat. At the edge of the Venom-Shade River, the armies of Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal gathered, their cold-blooded warriors bristling with tension. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the balance of the great plan was teetering on the edge of chaos. The clash of armies. The battle began with a deafening roar as the forces of Chaq-Huac surged forward, their ranks of Saurus warriors moving like a tidal wave. Chaq-Huac himself led the charge, riding atop a massive carnosaur whose deafening roar echoed through the jungle. Behind him, Bastiladons and Stegedons lumbered forward, their devastating weapons primed to unleash destruction. Tla'Zatal's forces met the charge with disciplined resolve. Kroxagors smashed through enemy lines with their massive hammers, while skink cohorts used the jungle's natural terrain to their advantage, launching ambushes and harrying attacks from the shadows. Chaq-Huac stood at the rear, directing her forces with precision from atop an ancient pterodon that swooped over the battlefield. They swept everything from its feet. The clash was ferocious. The jungle itself seemed to rebel against the violence, with trees toppling under the weight of charging stegedons and rivers churning red with blood. The cries of wounded warriors were drowned out by the sounds of battle, the screech of sharpened claws, the thunderous stomps of beasts, and the roar of fire as Chaq-Huac's Bastiladons unleashed their solar engines. One of the white towers had shattered on impact, leaving a white squall that later was replaced by the screech of feral interference. As the battle raged, the chaos drew unexpected participants. Packs of feral cold ones, maddened by the scent of blood, tore through both armies indiscriminately. Giant jungle serpents slithered from their hiding places to feast on the fallen, their emerald scales flashing in the sunlight. Even a lone dread saurian, a colossal predator, rarely seen, emerged from the depths of the jungle, scattering warriors from both cities as it trampled through the battlefield. The presence of these rogue beasts turned an already chaotic battle into utter pandemonium. Warriors found themselves fighting not just their enemy, but the jungle itself, their carefully laid strategies unraveling amid the carnage. At more than one point, Young fought with his crossbow, whilst a Ravenclaw on one side of him and a ghost boy on the other. Destruction of the sacred. In the heat of the conflict, neither side noticed the encroaching danger to the sacred ruins that dotted the jungle. Chaq-Huac's solar engines inadvertently struck a temple of the Old Ones, its ancient carvings disintegrating under the force of their beams. Tla'Zatal's Croxigors, in their desperate attempt to halt a Stegodon charge, toppled an obelisk inscribed with sacred glyphs. As more ruins were damaged or destroyed, the air grew heavy with an unnatural energy. Unbeknownst to the combatants, this desecration began to disturb the slain Mage-Priests, who remained deep in their meditative trances. Their floating palanquins trembled, and faint whispers of power rippled through the winds. The ancient beings stirred, their minds brushing against the chaos unfolding in the jungle. Though they did not yet awaken, the disruption was enough to send a shiver through the jungle's delicate balance. The tempest subsides. As dusk fell, the battle ground to a halt, neither side able to claim victory. The jungle floor was littered with the bodies of Saurus, skinks, and beasts, their blood soaking into the earth. The surviving warriors retreated to their respective camps, their spirits heavy with exhaustion and uncertainty. Chotalan stood among his battered warriors, his carnosaur breathing heavily from its wounds. His rage simmered as he surveyed the battlefield, his mind churning with plans for revenge. "They will pay for this," he growled. "The great plan demands their annihilation." Ziggurats, perched atop the pterodon, gazed down at the ruins of her forces and the devastated jungle. Her heart ached at the senseless destruction. "This cannot continue," she murmured to herself. "But how do we stop it?" The shadows stirred. As the warriors of both cities regrouped, strange rumors began to circulate among the survivors. Some claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving through the jungle, watching the battle from a distance. Others spoke of unnatural laughter carried on the wind, too guttural to be skink or Saurus. Chameleon skinks reported glimpses of warped figures, their outlines shimmering as if cloaked in illusion. One Saurus veteran, his scales darkened with dried blood, approached his commander with wide, unblinking eyes. "I saw something," he said in a low, halting voice. "Not of the jungle, not of the Old Ones." The reports reached both Chotlan and Ziggurats, but their interpretations differed. Chotlan dismissed them as fear-driven delusions, focusing instead on rallying his forces for the next confrontation. Ziggurats, however, could not shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. She convened her priests, urging them to investigate the strange sightings. The mystery deepens. Back in their respective cities, both leaders struggled to understand the implications of the battle. For Chotlan, the destruction of the sacred ruins was a regrettable but necessary sacrifice. For Ziggurats, it was a horrifying betrayal of the Old One's legacy. In the depths of the jungle, the shadowy figures moved with purpose, their unseen masters drawing closer to their goal. The battle had been but a step in a larger plan, one that thrived on the chaos and division between the twin cities. As the slain Mage-Priests began to stir, their ancient minds reached out, sensing the threads of manipulation woven into the conflict. The great plan was at risk, and the time for intervention was drawing near. But whether their awakening would come in time to prevent further disaster remained uncertain. For now, the jungle held its secrets close, and the cold-blooded tempest was far from over. Chapter 6. Whispers of the Deceiver. The jungle of Lustria grew darker, its shadows deeper, as an unseen presence worked tirelessly to turn the twin cities against each other. While Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal prepared for the next clash, strange events began to unfold in the contested territories, pulling the conflict toward an even deadlier precipice. The Deceiver revealed. Deep in the ruins of a forgotten temple, cloaked figures moved under the cover of night. Their forms were lithe and alien, their movements unnervingly precise. A small band of dark elf raiders, clad in muted armor that glinted faintly in the moonlight, inspected their latest handiwork, a desecrated shrine of the Old Ones. The Dark Elves had infiltrated Lustria weeks earlier, their ships hidden along the misty coasts. Under the command of a cunning sorceress named Calith Bryn, they sought to weaken the temple cities and loot the jungles of their ancient treasures. For Calith, the rising tensions between Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal were a golden opportunity to sow chaos and exploit the discord. Around the shrine, the Dark Elves had left deliberate clues, broken weapons and fragments of armor bearing the sigils of Tla'Zatal. The ruse was calculated to provoke Chaq-Huac into further aggression, driving the twin cities ever closer to mutual destruction. "Let the cold-blooded fools tear each other apart," Calith purred, her voice a venomous whisper. "When their warriors lie dead and their temples are defenseless, we will claim what is ours." The doubtful allies. Far from the desecrated shrine in the neutral jungle territories, two unlikely companions uncovered hints of the Dark Elves' interference. Quetli, a disillusioned skink priest from Chaq-Huac, had been questioning his city's growing fanaticism. He had fled the rigid confines of the priest-king's rule, seeking answers in the jungle. Puramlensi, Hitek took a rifle and a magazine, an approach walked to the vehicle that obviously belonged to the driver. Ziggurats, standing guard at home. A family of 3 children would not believe a supernaturally warrior had defected from Tla'Zatal, accompanied him, a veteran of countless battles. Hitek had stumbled upon each other during their respective journeys, united by their shared discontent. Their investigation brought them to the desecrated shrine. The glyphs of the Old Ones had been defaced, and sacrificial offerings lay scattered and broken. Quetli examined the fragments of armor left behind, his sharp eyes catching subtle inconsistencies. The markings of Tla'Zatal were too clean, too deliberate. "This is no act of Tla'Zatal," Quetli muttered, his crest flattening. "Someone else is stirring the waters." Hitek grunted, his claws flexing. "If not Tla'Zatal, then who? And why?" Their questions led them deeper into the jungle, where they uncovered more evidence, strange footprints, too light to belong to lizard men, and remnants of tools made from foreign metals. As the pieces began to fall into place, they realized the conflict between the twin cities was being orchestrated by an outside force. The struggle for truth. Wheatley and Hitek returned to their respective cities, determined to expose the truth. Wheatley stood before a council of priests in Chaq-Huac, presenting his findings. "We are being manipulated," he said, his voice trembling with urgency. "The desecrations are not the work of Tla'Zatal, but of outsiders. We must stop this madness before it is too late." His words were met with scorn. Tequatl, the high priest of Chaq-Huac, dismissed him with a wave of his claw. "You are a coward and a traitor," Tequatl snarled. "Tla'Zatal is the enemy. Your delusions serve only to weaken our resolve." In Tla'Zatal, Hetek fared no better. Ziggurats listened to his account but hesitated to act. Her advisors were divided. Some believed Hetek's warnings, while others insisted they were a ploy by Chaq-Huac to sow confusion. "The evidence is compelling," Ziggurats admitted. "But without proof of the perpetrator's identity, we cannot risk an action. If Chaq-Huac strikes again, we must be ready." Escalation. The Dark Elves, aware that their manipulations were beginning to unravel, escalated their efforts. Under Caliph Vrin's orders, they desecrated another sacred site, this time leaving behind artifacts associated with Chaq-Huac. The site, a sacred spawning pool, was vital to Tla'Zatal's skate population. Its desecration enraged Ziggurats, who saw it as an unforgivable act of war. In retaliation, Tla'Zatal launched a raid on a Chaq-Huac outpost, leaving several warriors dead. The priest-king Shotlan declared the attack proof of Tla'Zatal's corruption and ordered a full-scale mobilization of his forces. Unseen in the shadows, the Dark Elves watched with satisfaction. The jungle burned with the fires of war, and the twin cities edged closer to annihilation. Glimmer of awareness. Amid the chaos, Quetli and Hetek found themselves increasingly isolated. Both cities viewed them as traitors, yet they refused to abandon their mission. They continued to gather evidence, hoping to find something undeniable that would force their leaders to confront the truth. One fateful night, the pair stumbled upon a hidden Dark Elf camp. From the shadows, they watched as Caliph Vrin addressed her raiders, her words dripping with malice. "The coldbloods are blind to their doom," she said, her laughter echoing through the camp. "When they are but ashes, we shall claim the treasures of the old ones." Cutler's heart raced. At last, they had found the proof they needed, but getting that proof to their cities would be a challenge fraught with peril. The stage for catastrophe. As Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal prepared for a climactic confrontation, the jungle itself seemed to groan under the weight of their enmity. Sacred sites lay in ruins, their power diminished, and the whispers of the slain Mage-Priests grew louder as their meditations were disturbed. The manipulations of the Dark Elves had set the twin cities on a path of destruction. Whether Quetli and Hetek could reveal the truth in time, or if the truth would even be enough to stop the war, remained uncertain. For now, the whispers of the deceiver echoed through the jungle, a harbinger of greater darkness to come. Chapter 7. Storm over the Ziggurats. The skies over Lustria churned with dark clouds, casting shadows over the emerald jungle. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the armies of Chaq-Huac prepared for their assault. At the forefront of the force stood Priest King Jotan, his massive carnosaur stamping the ground impatiently, the beast's low growls echoing through the humid air. Around him, ranks of Saurus warriors stood motionless, their weapons gleaming in the faint light. Behind them, Bastialdons and Stygidons prepared to unleash their devastating power. The target was Tla'Zatal's greatest temple, Ziggurats, the spiritual heart of the city, and a symbol of its unity. To Shotlan, its capture would be the ultimate proof of Chaq-Huac's superiority and righteousness in the eyes of the Old Ones. "This is the will of the Old Ones," Shotlan declared to his assembled army. "Tla'Zatal's heresy must be purged. Today, we strike a blow for the great plan." The assault. The battle began at dawn. Chaq-Huac's forces surged through the jungle, their approach heralded by the thunderous stomps of war beasts. Skink scouts from Tla'Zatal sounded the alarm, and the city's defenders scrambled into position. Atop the ziggurat, High Priestess Chaq-Huac directed her warriors, her voice rising above the chaos. "Hold your ground," she commanded. "The Old Ones are with us." The OTLAS Croxigors formed a bulwark at the base of the ziggurat, their massive hammers swinging in devastating arcs. Skink cohorts darted through the narrow streets, launching ambushes on Chaq-Huac's advancing Saurus. The ziggurat's defenses included hidden traps and sacred wards, which slowed the attackers but did little to break their momentum. Chaq-Huac's war beasts proved devastating. A Bastiladon's solar engine unleashed a blinding beam of energy, obliterating a defensive barricade. A Stegodon, its spiked tusks gleaming, charged through a column of Croxigors, scattering them like leaves. The battle was a cacophony of roars, screams, and the crash of weapons. The sacred ziggurat trembled under the weight of the conflict, its ancient stones stained with the blood of its defenders. The betrayal unveiled. As the battle raged, a group of chameleon skinks from Tla'Zatal infiltrated the jungle surrounding their city. Tasked with identifying weaknesses in Chaq-Huac's siege lines, they instead stumbled upon an unsettling scene. Hidden among the foliage, a band of dark elf raiders watched the battle unfold with detached amusement. Their leader, Calith Rin, Clifford with her sorceress staff in hand, whispering incantations that seemed to influence the battle. "Do not intervene yet," Calith instructed her followers. "Let them destroy each other. When the victor stands bloodied and broken, we will strike." The skinks, horrified, reported their discovery to Chaq-Huac. She immediately ordered her priests to spread the word among her warriors, hoping to turn the tide by revealing the true enemy. However, in the chaos of battle, the warnings were met with skepticism. Many believed the claims were a desperate ploy to sow doubt among Chaq-Huac's forces. Meanwhile, Shotlan received his own reports of shadowy figures near the battlefield. Tequatal, the high priest of Chaq-Huac, dismissed them as lies. "This is Tequatal's deception," he insisted. "They seek to confuse us and undermine our righteous cause." Both leaders clung to their convictions, blinded by their enmity. The rogue faction's involvement, though partially exposed, did nothing to halt the battle's momentum. The fall of the ziggurat. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Chaq-Huac's forces breached the ziggurat's outer defenses. Exhaltlan, atop his carnosaur, led the final charge up the steps of the great temple. The defenders, though exhausted, fought valiantly. Chaq-Huac herself joined the fray, wielding her ceremonial staff with skill and determination. At great cost, Chaq-Huac's warriors overwhelmed Tla'Zatal's defenders. The ziggurat's summit became a brutal melee, with skinks, Saurus, and Croxigors falling in droves. Finally, Shotlan confronted Chaq-Huac at the altar of the Old Ones. Their clash was fierce but brief. Wounded and outnumbered, Chaq-Huac was forced to retreat with their surviving warriors, vanishing into the jungle. Chaq-Huac's victory was hard-won. The ziggurat stood in their hands, but the cost was staggering. Hundreds of Saurus and skinks lay dead, and many of their war beasts were slain or gravely injured. The city of Chaq-Huac itself had been left vulnerable, its garrisons depleted in the assault. The aftermath, light workouts, and dared not forget that plighted the past. In the jungle, Chaq-Huac regrouped with her battered forces. Her heart ached for her city, now under enemy control. Yet her resolve hardened. "This is not the end," she told her warriors. "The great plan demands unity, and we will reclaim it." A dangerous weakness of the deep American title. The Dark Elves watched the aftermath with satisfaction. The Twin Cities, though still standing, were now shadows of their former strength. Calith Vryn smiled as she gave her next command. The ziggurat is theirs, but their strength is spent. Now we strike. As the Dark Elves prepared their assault, the jungle stirred ominously. The Slan Mage-Priests, disturbed by the desecration of the sacred sites, began to awaken. Their ancient minds reached out, sensing the threads of manipulation woven through the conflict. Yet whether their intervention would come in time to prevent further disaster remained uncertain. The storm over the Ziggurats had passed, but its consequences were far-reaching. Both Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal were vulnerable, their strength diminished, their unity shattered, and in the shadows, the true enemy prepared to unleash the next phase of its plan. Chapter 8. Revelation of the Great Plan. The jungle of Lustria was cloaked in an eerie stillness. The aftermath of the battle for Tla'Zatal's great temple ziggurat had left both cities reeling, their warriors licking their wounds, their leaders wrestling with the weight of their decisions. The air itself seemed heavy, charged with an otherworldly energy that hinted at forces far older and far more dangerous than the cold-blooded inhabitants of the jungle. The awakening of the Slan. In the deepest sanctum of Tla'Zatal, hidden from the world by layers of foliage and stone, the Slan Mage-Priest Chaq-Huac stirred. For centuries the ancient being had remained in a state of profound meditation, his immense mind attuned to the distant echoes of the Old One's will. The destruction of the sacred ziggurat and the growing discord between the twin cities had disturbed his trance, pulling him back to the physical realm. His ancient eyes opened, glowing faintly with otherworldly light. His vast intellect reached out across the jungle, taking in the devastation wrought by the civil war. The whispers of unseen enemies tickled the edges of his consciousness, and the Slan's mind turned to action. He looked toward the Darkness House, feeling every obscure threatening to negotiate. Gathering his strength, Chaq-Huac summoned a council. From both Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal, emissaries were called, drawn by the undeniable power of his will. Despite their mistrust, neither city could ignore the command of a Slan. Saluted to the cryptic edict, the council convened in the neutral ruins of the Starfall Plateau, where Chaq-Huac's floating palanquin descended upon the gathered warriors and priests. The Slan's presence was overwhelming, his aura of authority silencing even the most hardened Saurus generals. His booming voice echoed through the jungle, carrying a message that resonated with both cities. "You have betrayed the great plan," Chaq-Huac declared, his words slow and deliberate, each one carrying the weight of millennia. "Your pride and division have blinded you to the truth. The Old Ones did not create you to fight among yourselves. Their will is unity, for only together can you fulfill their design." His massive hand gestured toward the jungle. "A greater threat stirs in the shadows, feeding on your discord. If you do not heed my words, the great plan will falter, and Lustria will fall." The Slan offered no specifics, only a cryptic warning. "The fractures in your path lead to the abyss. You must mend them, or all is lost." "Do you think you have already done so?" With that, Chaq-Huac withdrew into silence, leaving the emissaries to grapple with the weight of his proclamation. To skepticism and regret. The emissaries returned to their cities, carrying the Slan's message to their leaders. In Chaq-Huac, Shotlan sat on his obsidian throne, his claws gripping the armrests as he listened to the report. Though the words of the Slan carried undeniable authority, his pride and the recent victory over Tla'Zatal made him hesitate. "This is a test," Shotlan declared to his council. "The Slan speaks of unity, but Tla'Zatal's treachery cannot be ignored. They must first repent for their crimes before we can consider reconciliation. In Tla'Zatal, Chaq-Huac wrestled with her own doubts. The Slam's words resonated deeply, and she felt the weight of her city's losses keenly. Yet her pride, and the anger of her warriors over the destruction of their sacred ziggurat, made her pause. "We cannot deny the Slan's wisdom," she told her advisors. "But how can we trust Chaq-Huac when they desecrate our holy sites and spill our blood? They must prove their sincerity before we risk alliance." Both leaders, though shaken, remained entrenched in their positions. The wounds of war ran deep, and the pride of their cities created an impasse. "Damped," said Seraph. "It's too much to resist." The rising danger. While the twin cities struggled with the Slan's edict, the true enemy made its move. Under the cover of darkness, the Dark Elves launched their offensive. Using stolen glyphs and artifacts, they disguised their attacks to appear as if they came from the opposing city. Skink outposts along Chaq-Huac's borders were incinerated by corrupted solar engines, while Tonatel's waterways were poisoned with alchemical toxins. The twin cities, unaware of the deception, interpreted these attacks as acts of renewed hostility. Tensions rose once more, and both sides began mobilizing their battered armies for what they believed would be the final battle. Signs of the deceiver. Amid the rising chaos, Quetley and Hectek, the Skin-Priest and Saurus defector who had uncovered the Dark Elf manipulation, desperately worked to expose the truth. They intercepted messages between the raiders, gathering irrefutable proof of the enemy's involvement. The pair returned to the Starfall Plateau, hoping to present their findings to emissaries from both cities. Yet, as they prepared to reveal their evidence, Caleth Vryn's agents struck. A squad of shadow-cloaked assassins ambushed the duo, injuring Hectek and scattering their documents. Quetley narrowly escaped with his life, vowing to make one last attempt to warn his people. A looming catastrophe. The Slan's edict hung heavy over both Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal, yet pride and the manipulations of the Dark Elves drove them closer to renewed war. In the heart of the jungle, Caleth Vryn prepared for her final move, confident that the twin cities would destroy each other, leaving Lustria ripe for plunder. In the distance, the skies darkened further, and the jungle's creatures grew restless. The ancient power of the Slan stirred once more, their minds preparing for intervention. But whether their wisdom could heal the fractured paths of Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal, or whether the cities would doom themselves to annihilation, remained uncertain. Chapter 9. The Blood Debt. The jungle shivered under the weight of impending doom. Skink priests from both Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal, their crests drooping with fear, whispered of omens. Dark shadows moved through the jungle, carrying with them an aura of death and malice. The manipulative force that had sown chaos between the twin cities was now preparing to strike directly. Lustria itself seemed to cry out for unity. The reluctant alliance. In the ruins of the Starfall Plateau, emissaries from both cities gathered at the behest of the Slan Mage-Priest Chaq-Huac. For weeks, tension had been thick as war loomed ever closer. But now, faced with irrefutable proof of the Dark Elves' treachery brought by Quetley and the wounded Hectek, the rival factions could no longer deny the truth. Priest King Sholan of Chaq-Huac stood rigid, his claws flexing as he listened to the accounts of desecration and deception. His pride resisted the idea of working with Tla'Zatal, but the Slan's earlier warning weighed heavily on him. "This does not absolve your city's past crimes," he growled. "But if the great plan demands unity, I will not refuse." "Keep working," Quinn said. High Priestess Chaq-Huac of Tla'Zatal inclined her head, her voice calm but firm. "Our divisions have weakened us, Priest King. If we do not stand together now, there will be no cities left to rebuild." Under the watchful gaze of Chaq-Huac, the twin cities agreed to a fragile alliance. Their forces, skin cohorts, Chaq-Huac and Saurus warriors, joined together in uneasy cooperation. Bastiladons and stegadons from both cities formed a massive war host, their handlers whispering reassurances as the great beasts growled at one another. The Great Defense. The Dark Elves launched their assault at dawn, striking at the jungle's heart where the ruins of the Starfall Plateau lay. From the shadows emerged sleek, black-armored raiders wielding weapons glinting with venomous enchantments. Sorcerous spells crackled through the air, igniting trees and creating illusions to disorient the defenders. The Lizardmen forces, though battered and mistrustful, responded with ferocity. Skink cohorts darted through the underbrush, hurling javelins and leading the Dark Elves into ambushes, where waiting Chaq-Huac smashed them with massive stone hammers. Saurus warriors, fighting shoulder to shoulder for the first time in years, held the line against waves of charging raiders. On the plateau itself, Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal stood atop the crumbling ziggurat, directing the battle. For the first time, the two leaders fought side by side. Chaq-Huac's golden helm gleamed as he swung his obsidian mace, cutting down raiders with brutal efficiency. Tla'Zatal's voice rang out like a bell, her commands rallying the skink priests to heal the wounded and invoke protective glyphs. Despite their combined strength, the battle was far from certain. The Dark Elves' cunning tactics and sorcery tested the Lizardmen's resolve. A group of Cold One knights broke through the left flank, scattering Asora's cohort and threatening the warhost's rear. It was only the intervention of a stegadon from Tla'Zatal, its tusks sweeping the knights aside, that saved the line from collapse. The turning point. As the battle raged, Caelith Vryn revealed herself, stepping onto the field with an aura of malevolent power. Her sorcerer's staff crackled with dark energy as she unleashed bolts of chaos, disintegrating a group of skinks. Her laughter echoed across the battlefield, taunting the defenders. "See how easily you fall?" she sneered. "Your precious great plan is nothing but dust, scattered by the winds of your own arrogance." Paul kept staring down at his plate, wondering if he was really going to lose his seat. Her appearance galvanized the Dark Elf forces, who pushed forward with renewed ferocity. Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal recognized the danger immediately. Together, they led a counterattack, their war beasts charging directly toward Caelith's position. The sight of the two leaders fighting side by side, their forces unified, inspired the defenders to rally. A number of warriors, Caelith unleashed a devastating spell, but Chaq-Huac, who had remained meditating within the ziggurat, intervened. The ancient Slan's immense power clashed with her dark magic, creating a swirling vortex of energy that disrupted the battlefield. The balance hung precariously, and victory demanded a sacrifice. As Caelith prepared a final spell to shatter the Lizardmen's forces, Chaq-Huac, the defected Saurus warrior, saw his chance. Wounded but undeterred, he charged through the fray, his greatsword raised high. He roared a challenge, drawing Caelith's attention away from the Slan. Her spell lashed out at him, but he pressed on, his scaled hide smoking from the dark energy. With one mighty swing, Chaq-Huac struck Caelith down, her sorceress staff shattering as she fell. But her final spell detonated, engulfing Chaq-Huac in a blinding explosion of light and shadow. When the smoke cleared, the Dark Elf sorceress was dead, but so too was the brave Saurus, who had given his life to end her reign of terror. The remaining Dark Elves, leaderless and demoralized, fled into the jungle, hunted down by skink scouts and chameleon skinks. The battlefield fell silent, save for the mournful cries of the wounded. A symbol of unity. As the survivors gathered to honor their dead, Chotlan and Chaq-Huac stood over the body of Hectek. The Saurus warrior, once a defector, had become a symbol of the unity the cities had forgotten. Chaq-Huac spoke first. Her voice filled with sorrow. He gave everything for the great plan. We must not let his sacrifice be in vain. Chotlan nodded, his pride tempered by the day's events. The Old Ones demand unity. Perhaps it is time we set aside our grievances and rebuild. For the first time in years, the leaders of Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal clasped hands in mutual respect. Their alliance, born of necessity, had proven the strength of their combined might. The battle had exacted a heavy toll, but it had also sown the seeds of reconciliation. As the jungle began to heal, Chaq-Huac returned to his meditation, his presence a silent reminder of the great plan's unyielding demand for unity. For now, Lustria was safe, but the cost of discord would not soon be forgotten. Chapter 10. Harmony Restored. The jungle of Lustria was quiet once more, its vibrant sounds returning, as if the land itself exhaled in relief. The great battle at Starfall Plateau was over, and the blood of the fallen had nourished the earth. Yet, for Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal, the work of healing had only just begun. Rebuilding the twin cities, the deathly silence of the middle was broken only by the sounds of life. In Chaq-Huac, the survivors returned to a city that bore the scars of its martial zeal. Once proud Ziggurats stood damaged, and sacred pools shimmered faintly, their waters disturbed by the conflict. Chotlan, his golden helm dulled from battle, strode through the city's plazas, directing Saurus warriors and skink artisans in the reconstruction efforts. Walls were fortified, and the glyphs of the old ones were repainted with fresh reverence. In Tla'Zatal, the focus was on renewal. Croxagors labored to rebuild the ruined aqueducts, while skink priests purified the desecrated water wars. Chaq-Huac presided over ceremonies of healing, her voice calm but firm as she urged her people to look forward. "We have endured," she told them. "Now we must thrive, together." For the first time in centuries, emissaries from both cities traveled freely between Chaq and Tla'Zatal. Their missions were no longer shrouded in suspicion, but aimed at collaboration. A council was formed, composed of skink priests, Saurus generals, and even Croxagor representatives, tasked with creating a shared interpretation of the Great Plan. Though differences remained, the council's formation was a monumental step toward unity. The Slan's legacy. Chaq-Huac, the Slan Mage-Priest who had awakened to guide the twin cities, withdrew once more into meditation. His words, delivered during the council's first meeting, echoed in the hearts of all who heard them. The Great Plan is vast, beyond the comprehension of any one mind, but unity is its foundation. Divided, you falter. Together, you rise. Other surviving Slan Mage-Priests, stirred from their deep trances by the events of the past months, reaffirmed Chaq-Huac's decree. From their meditative states, they sent visions and dreams to the skink priests, urging cooperation and vigilance. Meanwhile, the remnants of the rogue faction were hunted down. Skink scouts tracked the fleeing dark elves deep into the jungle, ambushing their scattered raiding parties. Calith Rin's death had fractured their unity, and without her leadership, the raiders were no match for the cold-blooded precision of Lustria's defenders. By the end of the season, no trace of the Dark Elves remained, and their taint was purged from the sacred lands. A joint ceremony. The ceremony is organized. The climax of this new era of cooperation came in the form of a grand ceremony at the Starfall Plateau. Representatives from both cities gathered at the ancient ruins where their alliance had been forged. Skink priests chanted hymns of unity, their voices rising to the heavens as the Stygodometers stood as silent sentinels. Chotlan and Chaq-Huac clad in ceremonial regalia, ascended the steps of the central ziggurat together. They stood before a crowd of Saurus, skinks, and Croxagores from both cities, their figures framed by the golden light of the setting sun. He hoped he was accurate in his judgment, that it spelled out what he'd seen. Very heavy metallic. Chotlan spoke first, his voice resonant with authority. "We have seen the cost of discord. The great plan demands strength, but strength must serve unity." Kalifu Koknu. Kazikwa followed, her tone steady and resolute. "Let this day mark the beginning of a new era. Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal will stand together, for the old ones made us one people." As the ceremony reached its peak, the two leaders clasped hands, sealing their pledge to maintain the fragile peace. The crowd erupted in roars and hisses of approval, the sounds of hope echoing through the jungle. Final reflections. As the ceremony concluded and the participants began to disperse, the leaders of both cities lingered at the summit of the ziggurat. The human being beside him drew a deep gurgling sound and opened his eyes in expression of pensive. "This peace is necessary," he admitted, "but it is also fragile. The jungle is unforgiving, and there will always be those who seek to exploit our weaknesses." Kazikwa nodded, her gaze steady. "Fragility is no excuse to abandon the effort. The great plan is not easy, but it is worth fighting for." The two leaders descended the ziggurat together, their steps measured but purposeful. Below them, the combined forces of Chaq-Huac and Tla'Zatal mingled, their shared experiences forging bonds that would endure long after the ceremony ended. In the distance, the jungle thrummed with life, a testament to the resilience of Lustria and its defenders. Though the path ahead was uncertain, the twin cities had taken the first steps toward true harmony. For now, the great plan was safe, and the old one's legacy endured. They were a blessing from God, not a threat.